Hello everyone, this is Jason Tondro, and I'm your professor for World Lit 2111, and we are here to finish up our conversation of Beowulf. So let's get into it. When last we left off, Beowulf had I'm already ahead of myself. Beowulf had defended the hall of Heorot against the monster Grendel, which had invaded, and Beowulf had managed to out-wrestle the thing and had physically torn its arm off as it escaped. Then they hoist the arm up as a trophy. And there's some congratulatory moments, but more important, there's some conversation in the hall after Grendel is defeated, and we get some insight into the political situation at Heorot and the instability that Beowulf's arrival with his men has created in the hall. Hrothgar and Wealhtheow are grateful. Hrothgar probably more so. He's the one that's thanking God for Beowulf's arrival. They both shower Beowulf with gifts, but his presence in the hall has created a political instability in the sense that Hrothgar has adopted Beowulf as his son, but Hrothgar already has two sons and a nephew, all of whom could be considered heirs to the throne. So how is that all going to resolve itself? And as we have seen in our histories of this culture, from what we have, other examples of this culture, and what we have read so far, these conflicts always end in violence. They always end with somebody trying to seize control or attack their rivals or get payback for an old grudge, and pretty soon the two clans are fighting, and everybody gets killed, and then the winner grabs the local woman and takes her off home. And this is perhaps to explain Wealhtheow's desire to, praise Beowulf, honor and respect Beowulf, but then suggest that Beowulf, for the good of everybody, should head on home. Well, so what happens then? Well, for those of you that have already read, I'm just skimming through the plot a little bit here. They all bunk down in the night for the night, and we discover Grendel's mother. There are some uncertainties in this text, some questions that the book poses to us, which we as readers are often confused by, and there's no clear answer as to what's going on in this book. Part of that is because of the difficulties of translation. Some of that is because the story is 1,300 years old, and we know so little about the culture in which it was created. And some of it is because of the history of the manuscript. And let's try to get into some of these. And a lot of it sort of focuses around Grendel's mother and around the pages in this section. And they'll help to illustrate some of these questions. So let's start off with one. Why is it that Beowulf fights three monsters, but the second one is the weakest? You would think, if you were plotting out a story, that each monster would be more dangerous than the one before. But Grendel's mother is specifically told to us to be weaker than her son, not by much. The poet says she was precisely as much less dangerous as an Amazon warrior is less dangerous than a man with a sword. By which the poet means she's still dangerous, but she's a woman, and so therefore less threatening. Why would you do that? Second example. Beowulf goes to the lake where Grendel's mother lives. After she's eaten somebody, she retreats, and she immediately flees out of the room. She's to be contrasted with Grendel, who stays in the hall and fights until he's defeated. Grendel's mother kills one guy and then runs when she gets caught. And they follow her to this lake. And then she goes down into the lake. And Beowulf has some discussions there on the lakeside in which, for example, Unferth returns as a character. You remember Unferth? We talked about him. He was kind of a jerk. When Beowulf first showed up, his name means unwise or reckless speech. Unferth gives Beowulf his sword, which has a name, Hrunting. And Beowulf acknowledges this gift and praises Unferth for it. Remember, Beowulf was a good talker. He knows how to relate to people. He's courteous and kind and generous with his praise. And he praises Unferth and says, I'm going to bring this right back. I'm going to go take care of this sea monster, this Grendel's mother. I'm going to come back and I'm going to give you this sword right back. Thank you. He's grateful for this gift. And then he goes down to the lake, and there's a bunch of sea monsters in the lake. But Beowulf's fought sea monsters before. We read this in his resume when he first landed on the coast, so this is no big deal for him. He gets down, and he starts to fight Grendel's mother. Can we find those scenes? I'm on the bottom of 147. Then the prince of the Wargeats, warming to this fight with Grendel's mother, gripped her shoulder and laid about him in a battle frenzy. He pitched his killer opponent to the floor. By this point, we've learned that his sword, Hrunting, is useless against Grendel's mother. It just bounces right off of her head. So he wrestles with her. He grabs her by the shoulder, he throws her to the floor. But she rose quickly and retaliated, grappled him tightly in her grim embrace. Now she's grabbing him. The sure-footed fighter felt daunted. The strongest of warriors stumbled and fell. He didn't stumble and fall against Grendel when he was wrestling Grendel. But against her, suddenly, he's on the ground. And he's not just on the ground, he's on his back. So she pounced upon him and pulled out a broad, whetted knife. Now she would avenge her only child. But the mesh of chainmail on Beowulf's shoulder shielded his life, turned the edge and tip of the blade. She jumps on top of him, and she's sort of straddling him, and she's got her knife out, and she tries to stab him, but his chainmail armor protects him. Okay. For the moment, let's just lodge in our mind this idea of Beowulf and Grendel's mother sort of wrestling in close. Now, when Beowulf is fighting Grendel, it's just two guys wrestling, right? Or one guy and a monster. But in this scene, Grendel's mother is female, and this has led some critics to see that maybe they begin to wonder, maybe there's something more going on here. Okay, let's just show that for a minute. We'll come back. Then, Beowulf spots this sword on the wall. The sword that he brought with him, Hrunting, is not doing the job. But he looks up and he sees this bigger, massive sword up on the wall. So he jumps up and he goes and gets it, and it's so big and heavy that only somebody as strong as Beowulf can carry it. So he pulls it off the wall and he chops her head off. Okay, fair enough. But then what does he do? Does he bring a trophy back up? Because remember, all of his colleagues, all of his friends are standing up at the top of the lake, and they all actually think that Beowulf's dead by now. They're already giving up, and they're walking home, because Beowulf's been on the bottom of the lake for a day, in that sort of fantastic supernatural way that Beowulf and other mythological characters can do. Does Beowulf take the head and bring it back up and show everybody, hey, look, here's proof, like the arm. Remember when he tore off Grendel's arm and they hoisted it up and they put the trophy up on the roof? Where's the trophy for Grendel's mother? Well, there isn't one. In fact, Beowulf instead finds Grendel deep in the house, and where apparently Grendel has gone to flee. He crawled there after his arm was torn off, and in the house he's dead already. And so Beowulf chops off Grendel's head and takes that head up to the surface of the water, where it takes 4 men to carry it because it's so big and heavy. And also, by the way, as soon as he gets up there, what happens to his sword? It melts. When the sword comes into contact with the sunlight, the sword melts like an icicle. It's a pretty cool image. Okay. So you have a mysterious confrontation with a female figure in which she's not as physically dangerous as Grendel or the dragon. You have this physical wrestling scene in which Beowulf and Grendel's mother are on the ground. She's straddling him. And you have the fact that Beowulf is separated from all of the other warriors. And the only evidence he has that he ever actually even killed Grendel's mother is his own word. Now, those of you that have seen the recent animated Beowulf, the computer-generated one, it's written and directed by Neil Gaiman. Gaiman is a fantasy writer. He's won the Fantasy Award for everything from Doctor Who episodes to comics that he's written. He's a big fan of Beowulf, of the poem, and that film is his answer to these questions. Okay. There's other uncertainties in the text. We're going to keep getting back to this. I wanted to spotlight more of these uncertainties that are in the text. For example, why is it that the poet seems to know that where Grendel comes from? The poet says Grendel is the spawn of Cain. But Hrothgar says Grendel is fatherless and comes from the wilderness where there's ghosts and demons and witches and stuff. In other words, we have 2 different origins for Grendel. Why would Hrothgar say something different than the poet knows to be the truth? Does he just not know? Or is there some ulterior motive? Well, all of this has created some speculation. One of these theories is that the person who composed Beowulf, the skald or poet, is different than the guy who wrote it down. That the guy who wrote it down was a monk. We know that. Christian monk. And maybe he edited the original text and inserted the Christian references. So in the original poem, Grendel didn't have a father. And that line from Hrothgar, that Grendel is fatherless and comes from out of the woods, that's a reference, that's a line from the original version of the poem. But these lines that talk about Grendel as being the spawn of Cain, and along with all of the other Christian references in the poem, those are additions added by the Christian scribe who wrote it down. Well, maybe. We don't know. But to go only that far is a perfectly plausible theory. Perfectly plausible. Okay. But then the theory goes on. Well, maybe we should look at this moment where Beowulf goes down into the water and there's nobody around, and he comes back up and he says, oh yeah, I killed her. Well, maybe in the original version of the poem, the one before the scribe got a hold of it, something else went on there. There was a different kind of confrontation. Maybe Grendel's mother was physically less challenging, but that's because the temptation was of a different sort. The challenge was of a different sort. Maybe she offered a deal. Don't kill me. This is why he doesn't bring a trophy up from her. This is why he doesn't show her head. Because he never killed her. She said, don't kill me, and I'll repay you somehow. And this becomes the original material, which the scribe then changes as he's writing it. So that instead of Beowulf and Grendel's mother having sex, he changes that so that they're fighting. But they're still in physical contact, still in a sexual position. But now she's got a knife, right? And Beowulf just goes back up and he says, oh yeah, I killed her. And in this version, in this scribe's version of the poem, that's true. He did kill her. Well, now we're getting farther out. Now it's not, now when we say, well, maybe, now we're starting to run out of evidence in the poem. It becomes a theory that's not illustrated by the poem. We can't point to lines and say this is for sure evidence that that's happening. We can point to inconsistencies in the poem, like this business with Cain's Cain's role in Grendel's parentage. We can say, well, this is weird because we've got two different stories here, and we can look at this moment when Beowulf cuts off Grendel's head and takes it up, but leaves no trophy, takes no trophy of the mother. We can look at that and say, well, that's weird. Beowulf's really big on trophies everywhere else in the poem, including the dragon, but here he doesn't take one. That's odd. Well, these pose questions. How we resolve those questions is still, is something we still talk about. But this theory that there was that this chapter on Grendel's mother was heavily rewritten by the scribe to take out all the sexy bits and instead make it a pretty straightforward physical confrontation in which Beowulf kills Grendel's mother, is one argument that you see when you watch that film, because Gaiman happens to be a big proponent of that theory. All right. So let's move on. Beowulf defeats Grendel's mother, or doesn't defeat her, depending on which version of the story you think you're reading. And then he returns to Herod, and Hrothgar, again, lavishes him with gifts. But more importantly, we have Hrothgar's great speech to Beowulf, his advice to Beowulf. Now, we should spend a little bit of time on this. It starts on the bottom of 151. With when Hrothgar says to Beowulf, so learn from this and understand true values. I who tell you have wintered into wisdom. And he begins to give Beowulf his advice that he, as an aged, wise king, can give to Beowulf. Because Beowulf's going to have the rest of his life ahead of him. And Hrothgar has benefited from his own experiences, and he wants to pass that on to Beowulf. It is a great wonder how Almighty God in his magnificence favors our race with rank and scope and the gift of wisdom. Isn't it amazing how much goodness we've gotten from God? Sometimes he allows the mind of a man of distinguished birth to follow its bent. He means to do as you wish, to do as you please. He allows a person to have his way. Grants him fulfillment and felicity on earth, and forts to command in his own country. He makes him wealthy and prosperous, and he gives him personal fulfillment, because the things that the individual person wants to do, he's able to attain. You want to cure cancer, you cure cancer. You want to bring world peace, you bring world peace. He permits him to lord it in many lands, until the man, in his unthinkingness, forgets that it will ever end for him. The person who's been so lucky, who's been graced by God, who's been able to do all of these amazing things, he starts to forget that his time is going to run out, that it's not going to break his way forever. He indulges his desires. Illness and old age mean nothing to him. His mind is untroubled by envy or malice or the thought of enemies with their hate-honed swords. The whole world conforms to his will. Everything he wants, he gets. He's one of those guys, right? Everything he wants, he gets. He is kept from the worst until an element of overweening enters him. This is pride. Overweening pride enters him, and takes hold while the soul's guard, its sentry, drowses, grown too distracted. A killer stalks him. This is pride manifested as a hunter, a killer. It's stalking the person. who's been graced by God, had good fortune all his life. He's been able to do the things he wants to do. He's found personal satisfaction. And because of that, he forgets who to credit. He thinks it's all him, and he forgets that, it doesn't last forever. His old possessions seem paltry to him now. When he was young, he dreamed of being rich. Now he is rich, but his riches now no longer satisfy him. He wants to be more rich. He covets and resents, dishonors custom, and bestows no gold. And this is the king's job, is to pass out wealth and treasures to the people underneath him to make them wealthy and to secure their loyalty. But now he becomes greedy and stingy, and he doesn't do that, and people get resentful. And because of good things that the heavenly powers gave him in the past, he ignores the shape of things to come. Then finally the end arrives, when the body he was lent, he is lent his body. This is an old poetic trope that you will see in poetry going back, well, from Beowulf all the way up to the present. This idea that you don't own your body. It doesn't belong to you. It's on loan. And one day, maybe in your 70s, or your 80s, or your 90s, or maybe someday by accident, tomorrow, or the day after, when you're in your 20s, or your 30s, or your 40s, the guy that loaned you that body is going to come back for it, and he's going to say, pay up. The body he was lent collapses and falls prey to its death. Ancestral possessions and the goods he hoarded are inherited by another who lets them go with a liberal hand. All that wealth that you were saving just goes to the next guy in line, and he gives it away, as he should. You can't take it with you is a cliche, but Hrothgar's point here is more serious, right? You shouldn't try to take it with you. You can't, and don't forget that it's not really yours to begin with. O flower of warriors, beware of that trap. Choose, dear Beowulf, the better part, eternal rewards. We don't talk about heaven very often in this book. Beowulf doesn't talk about heaven. Beowulf talks about how I want to earn fame here in this world today. And Hrothgar's saying, listen, you need to refigure your priorities, man. Do not give way to pride. For a brief while your strength is in bloom, but it fades quickly, and soon there will follow illness, or the sword to lay you low, or a sudden fire, or surge of water, or jabbing blade, or javelin from the air, or repellent age. Your piercing eye will dim and darken, and death will arrive, dear warrior, to sweep you away. Right? Beowulf is not thinking about his eternal rewards. He's not thinking about what's going to happen later. And Hrothgar's warning him, look, I know that you're strong and you're powerful, and you think it's going to last forever, but it's not. Take it from me, right? I'm in my 70s now. Take it from me. It's not going to last. This is Hrothgar's great advice to Beowulf. Now, ask yourself, as you read this poem, does Beowulf heed this advice? As soon as this speech is over, Beowulf gets on his boat and he goes home. And he goes back to his boss, whose name is suddenly escaping me, Hygelac. He goes back to his lord, Hygelac, back in Geatland. And he gives a bunch of the presents that he got from Hrothgar, he gives to Hygelac, right? It all pays upwards. And then that way Hygelac can use that wealth to reward other people, and he can keep the cycle of economy going. Well, eventually the political events in Geatland grow out of control. We skip a bunch of time soon after this. The first thing that happens is that Beowulf arrives back in Geatland, and he summarizes the events of his adventures in Denmark. Remember, this poem would have been told over multiple segments, over multiple evenings, probably several days, maybe even weeks apart. So people wouldn't necessarily have remembered what had happened in the beginning of the story, or, more importantly, there'd be just a different group of people altogether. Maybe some of them were there for the first part, but many of them wouldn't have been. So the poet feels obliged to recap the beginning of the story. Oh yeah, and I fought this monster, and then I fought his mother, and Hrothgar gave me all these presents, and then I came home. So there's a summary of Beowulf's previous adventures. But then what we find out is that Hygelac has a son, and when Hygelac dies, that son inherits, and he becomes king. And Beowulf supports that guy, that kid, and in fact he actually takes care of the kingdom for a little while the kid gets old enough to do his duty as a warrior king. But the Geats are raided by the Swedes. Now, we've talked about the Swedes last week. They're an off-stage presence. They're a menace that, we don't actually meet. No Swede walks on stage and talks, but they're constantly referred to by the Geats as one of our ancestral enemies, along with the Frisians. So the Swedes raid, and Hygelac's son is killed, and Beowulf is forced to take over the kingdom, not because he wants to, but because there's nobody else to do it. And then 50 years pass. There's this massive gap, this 50-year gap, which, as we mentioned last week, a lot of modern filmmakers and storytellers who get this, they don't know what to do with it, and they just kind of skip it. Now, Gaiman does not skip it in his version, the latest version of the poet, to make it to the big screen, which is to his credit, I think, because the poem doesn't make much sense thematically if you don't have an older, wiser Beowulf at the end of the story. But anyway, 50 years pass, and Beowulf is now king of his country. Not because he chose it, but because Hygelac and Hygelac's son are both dead. So now he, Beowulf, is now in Hrothgar's position. And like Hrothgar, whose reign was suddenly tormented by a mysterious monster that came out of nowhere, Beowulf's reign becomes tormented when a slave, like many of the people that we've been reading about so far, the Greeks, the Hebrews, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons kept slaves. Primarily, we're talking about slaves being people captured in war. If you raid the enemy attacks you, and you defeat them, and you got these prisoners, well, what do you do with them? Well, the answer is you put them to work. You're not going to kill them. Nobody gains anything from that. You put them to work. Well, anyway, so one of these slaves that's working in the household or something is creeping out at night, probably looking to plunder. He goes to what's called a barrow. Now, a barrow, you can get some images of this on Google and stuff, is like a hill. And the Anglo-Saxons and the Scandinavian people, they would find these low hills, and they would dig down underneath the hill. And the hill wouldn't be that big. It would be like maybe the size of a classroom. And they would dig underneath the hill, and they would hollow out a hole underneath that hill, and they would have one entrance down, one tunnel. It wouldn't be that big. There'd be an entranceway in the side of the hill made with rocks. They would just get big boulders, and they'd put one on one side, one on the other, and then another big rock on top. And these three objects would create kind of a doorway, an archway that would support the earth. And you'd have these tunnels. And one of these tunnels would lead down into this empty space underneath this hill. And this is where they would bury their wealthy, the kings and the other prominent citizens of the Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian cultures. And it's in one of these barrows that the dragon lives. Now, the slave guys probably go down there figuring, well, I'll loot the bodies. I'll find the bodies of these wealthy guys, and I'll steal their golden treasures, because, of course, they were buried with all of their wealth, right, as a tribute to the heroic deeds that they had done when they were living, or as a tribute to their generosity. So you've got, beautiful golden helmets and armbands and necklaces and rings and all of these, fabulous chainmail and weapons and all this stuff. So the slave goes down there and he finds a cup. It's a golden chalice or something, and he steals it. Well, the dragon lives down there in that barrow, and the dragon recognizes that the chalice has been stolen, and he rises up in anger and begins to ravage the countryside. Now, the dragon is not a person in the same sense that sometimes that Grendel actually had kind of a motivation sometimes. We actually talked about that. When the reason for Grendel's anger was he was outraged at people having a good time. It was community, the community spirit of people working together, playing together, enjoying each other's company. For an exile like Grendel, who is the child of an exile, right? The ultimate exile, Cain. A party is like the worst thing he can imagine, right? Because he's not invited and he doesn't get to have fun. The dragon is about theft. It's more like a force of nature than a human enemy like Grendel is. Well, the dragon begins destroying the countryside, and it specifically reenacts Grendel's attack on Harrowt. In other words, Beowulf's house, his royal household, is burned to the ground. So just in case we didn't get the parallel with Beowulf and Hrothgar and the dragon and Grendel, just in case we didn't get that, it's actually made even more explicit for us when the dragon comes in and attacks Beowulf's house. And he burns it to the ground, and Beowulf is obliged to decide, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to do what Hrothgar did? And hide, right? And wait for a champion to come sailing in on the whale road and take care of this matter for you. Well, that's not the kind of guy Beowulf is. He's a fighter, and this was a flaw in Hrothgar. Hrothgar should have manned up and taken this problem on by himself. Beowulf is better than that. But he has his own flaw. His flaw of pride, right? That Hrothgar saw and called out and warned Beowulf about as Beowulf was departing. Does Beowulf learn from Hrothgar's speech? Well, on one hand, you can say, no. No, he doesn't. Because as soon as the dragon shows up, Beowulf decides he's got to go fight it. Page 165. Yet the Prince of the Rings was too proud to line up with a large army against the sky plague. And later on, he goes out there to find the dragon with a group of about a dozen guys, and he tells all of them, this is page 169, Men-at-arms, remain here on the Barrow, safe in your armor, to see which one of us is better in the end at bearing wounds in a deadly fray. This fight is not yours, nor is it up to any man except me to measure his strength against the monster, or to prove his worth. Now, he's 70 years old, and he's not stupid. He knows the dragon is a bigger menace even than Grendel, and he does exactly the opposite. You notice that when he was going to fight Grendel, he was like, well, Grendel doesn't even use a weapon, so I'm not going to use a weapon either. I'm going to kill it with my bare hands. He doesn't do that now. He does exactly the opposite. He says, I need to armor up. He has like the weapon gathering scene, like in every action movie we've ever seen, when the guy straps on his guns, or Batman puts on his body armor, or all that stuff, Beowulf's version is when he goes out and he gets a special shield made of solid iron. Now, shields like this would be enormously heavy. Most Viking shields were made of wood, light wood, with a metal thing in the center that you would hold on to. It's just a metal disc with a single handle on the back, and then all the wooden shield is attached to that, and it's got a ringer on the outside, probably of leather. It was really light because you needed to be able to maneuver it really fast when a guy comes at you with an axe. You need to be able to bat his weapon away. But they weren't real sturdy. And Beowulf understood that, look, this is not going to hold up against a dragon, so he gets an iron shield made, which would be really, really heavy, but we understand that this is Beowulf's superpower, right? Beowulf is really, really strong. So he can carry a shield that's made of iron, and he can get along just fine. Okay, so he gets the shield made, and he's going into it fighting in his armor, and he's got, weapons and all this stuff. He's not going in to wrestle the dragon with his bare hands anymore. He's 70 years old or more. But then he tells his men to all wait. He says, all right, all you guys stay in the car. Okay? Now, this is different. Think about what happens when he fights Grendel. He's got all of his men, and he brings all of his men, and they all hang out there in the house in Harrowed. And when Grendel attacks, Beowulf fights him. But Beowulf never tells his men, look, let me fight him by myself. It's understood that he's the champion. But everybody else throws in and helps. Now, in fact, what we find out is that Grendel's immune to weapons. So the other men actually cannot help, but they try. They try to help. That's not what happens here. Beowulf tells them all right, I want y'all to wait here. I'm going to go fight the dragon. It's probably going to kill me, but I'm going to take it down too. And then he goes to do that. He goes to fight the dragon. And the other guys, what should they be doing? They should be jumping in and helping. But they don't. They run. They run for the woods. Except for one guy. His name is Wiglaf. And Wiglaf, first he chews him out. He's like, hey. Page 170. When he saw his lord tormented by the heat of his scalding helmet, the dragon's been breathing fire on Beowulf, and Beowulf's helmet is now like glowing red. He remembered the bountiful gifts bestowed on him, how well he lived among the Wagmundings, the freehold he inherited from his father before him. And there's another line where Wiglaf chews out the other warriors, and he notes that Beowulf was a generous king. Well, this suggests that Beowulf did learn from Hrothgar, because this is exactly the problem that Hrothgar's warning Beowulf about. Like, you're going to get old, and you're going to start to get greedy, and you're not going to give out wealth and treasures anymore, and the men are going to hate you for it. Well, the poem tells us that Beowulf didn't do that. So wait a minute. Was Beowulf too proud, and he didn't learn from Hrothgar? Or did he learn from Hrothgar, and he gave out lots of treasures, and the men betrayed him anyway? Well, that's a really good question. All right, so Wiglaf jumps in, and together the two of them are able to fight off the dragon. The dragon burns up Wiglaf's shield, because of course it's just made of wood. Beowulf hides him behind the shield. Wiglaf swings at the dragon with his sword and manages to hurt it, and this distracts the dragon long enough that even though Beowulf's already been bit, he's bit in the shoulder. And he's got poison. The dragon has poison in its teeth. So Beowulf is dying. He's got a sword. He uses it on the dragon, but we find out that this is Beowulf's problem, is that he's too strong for swords. When he swings a sword, his strength is so great that the sword just breaks. Well, so that's what happens again. And it's not until he pulls out a knife and he stabs the dragon in the belly that he's able to finally kill it. But it's too late for Beowulf. He's already dying from poison. And we get a number of speeches where Beowulf tells Wiglaf, all right, go into the Barrow and pull out all those treasures that are down there, including there's this banner, like a standard, a flag. That's the prized treasure of the dragon. Bring out all that stuff. Because if I'm going to die, I want to see what I died to get. And I'm going to die knowing that all of this wealth is going to go to my people when I die. Well, that's a very nice thought, isn't it? Except that it's wrong. Okay? Remember the Beowulf poet's overriding compulsion in this poem is that no good deed lasts forever. In fact, they don't even last very long. Beowulf is generous and good to his men, but they abandon him in his hour of need. Beowulf dies to get the treasure, and he dies confident and content. Let's say content, because the treasures he's gotten are going to go to his people. But then we find out after the fight is over, Beowulf says, "To the everlasting Lord of all, to the King of glory, I give thanks that I behold this treasure here in front of me, that I have been allowed to leave my people so well endowed on the day I die, now that I have bartered my last breath to own this fortune." Well, so this is his dying words. But Wiglaf notes it's not going to last. He chews out the warriors that ran. Anyone ready to admit the truth will surely realize that the Lord of men, who showered you with gifts, he's talking not about God, but about Beowulf, showered you with gifts and gave you the armor you are standing in, was throwing weapons uselessly away. He gave you all these armor and all these weapons, and what did you do with them? Nothing. So it is goodbye now to all you know and love on your home ground. The open-handedness, the giving of war swords, every one of you with freeholds of land, our whole nation will be dispossessed, once princes from beyond get tidings of how you turned and fled and disgraced yourselves. A warrior will sooner die than live a life of shame. And Wiglaf goes on to recite their ancient enemies. He talks first about the Frisians, and then he talks about the Swedes. And he goes on for another couple of pages about how the Swedes have this code of vengeance. You know, I should say they all have a code of vengeance. The Swedes have a good reason to hate the Geats, because the Geats killed some of them. And so the Swedes are going to invade, and they're going to conquer everyone. Page 179. He's talking about the treasure, the royal treasury that Beowulf died to acquire. Treasure no follower will wear in his memory, nor lovely woman link and attach as a torque around her neck. But often, repeatedly, in the path of exile, they shall walk bereft, bowed under woe. In the path of exile. This is the great awfulness of Beowulf's world, right? To be exiled, to be kicked away from your home. These people are going to be made slaves. The Swedes are going to invade. They're going to take everything that the Geats have, because the Geats have no king, and they don't have any defenders. The guys that were supposed to be protecting Beowulf, the guys that were supposed to be the defenders of the throne, they all ran for the woods, right? And everyone's going to know that they were a bunch of cowards, and the Swedes and the Franks are going to invade, and they're going to take everything. And all that treasure that Beowulf died thinking, oh, well, thank God that I've got this treasure that I can give to my people, that's all going to be taken. It was for nothing. They were disconsolate. This is on page 181. They were disconsolate and wailed aloud for their lord's decease. A Geat woman, too, sang out in grief. With her hair bound up, she unburdened herself of her worst fears, a wild litany of nightmare and lament. Her nation invaded, enemies on the rampage, bodies in piles, slavery and abasement. Heaven swallowed the smoke. Awfulness is going to happen to these people, and heaven is going to do nothing about it. Heaven swallows the smoke. It's like Job crying to God saying, why are you doing these awful things to me? And God's answer is, you don't get an answer. Right? This scene of the woman who's unnamed, the unnamed woman, Geat woman, whose cries, whose wailing just rises up with the smoke to an unhearing and unsympathetic heaven. It's a really memorable moment from the poem, and one that's often referred to by readers and critics later on. They let the ground keep that ancestral treasure. Beowulf is buried. He's buried in a mound. They burn his body, and then what remains they put inside the mound. They let the ground keep that ancestral treasure, gold under gravel, gone in earth, as useless to men now as it ever was. Right? The treasure that Beowulf fought and died for. It's useless. We're not quite to the end. We'll talk a little bit more about some other things in the poem, but you can see why this poem was so confusing to the people of the people who read it in the 1900s, before Tolkien got a hold of it. And they saw, well, it's not like the Aeneid, it's not like the Iliad or the Odyssey. It doesn't have any... They didn't recognize the themes that were in it. This is a poem written by a very jaded and cynical people that recognized that the world was dangerous and they lived in fear. And being Christian, having faith in God, that didn't make them any less fearful, because they looked around, they didn't see any signs of God's affection. Right? They saw political instability, warfare, and injustice. And they asked themselves, how do we respond to that? I mean, how do we live in that world? And poems like this are their answer. Now, this doesn't mean that Beowulf isn't a good guy and he's worthy of respect. They said that of all the kings upon earth, he was the man most gracious and fair-minded. These are the attributes of a great man. Number one, gracious, by which they mean generous. He's giving. And fair-minded, kindest to his people, and keenest to win fame. He wanted to be famous more than anybody in the world. And in this book, that's a good quality. And I think we can identify with that. I know a lot of people that want to be famous. I think the reason why Beowulf is having kind of a resurgence right now, and Neil Gaiman's version of the poem, his movie, is only one of several films that have been made lately based on this. I think one of the reasons why Beowulf is getting a resurgence now, why Haney is translating it, why more people are reading it in high school, why we're talking about it in college classrooms more than ever, is because we recognize this people and we recognize their situation. We look around at our world and we think about injustice and we think about rulers that aren't doing right by the people they're supposed to serve. And we think about the awfulness that goes on around us and we wonder not why, because we can't answer that question. We can't answer why do bad things happen to good people. Let's give up on that. And instead ask, how do we live in a world where we acknowledge bad things happen to good people? What do you do? And this poem tries to answer that in its way. There's a couple of other sections that are worth looking at. Maybe we should group this under the term mothers and fathers. Beowulf's last moment when he's dying, he looks back on his life and he judges himself. Now, this is the standard to which he kept himself. And I think that we're supposed to take this as instructive for our own lives. I took what came, I'm on page 173. I took what came, cared for and stood by things in my keeping, never fomented quarrels, never swore to a lie. All this consoles me, doomed as I am and sickening for death. Because of my right ways, the ruler of mankind need never blame me when the breath leaves my body for murder of kinsmen. He says, I did the right thing in the situations I was given. That's all that I could do. And keep in mind all the family quarrels that we see in this book. When he says, I never fomented a quarrel, I never got involved in a family feud, I never helped stir it on so that people got revenge, that's no small boast in this book. Because that struggle between factions. You can call them Hatfields and McCoys, you can call them Republicans and Democrats, or you can call them whites and blacks, or you can call them whatever. That factional fighting. Beowulf says, I never got involved in any of that. That's something to brag about. I never swore to a lie. That's pretty important too. Beowulf can't control the injustice of the world. He can only control his actions in response to those injustices. And I think that this poem, like the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid and the Bible, are designed to teach the people in the audience how to live their lives. In his essay, A Defense of Poetry, written in the 16th century, Phillips Sidney, he was an aristocrat in the court of Queen Elizabeth and before her father. Sidney says there's basically two ways to teach. The first way is what he calls by rote, which is by lecture. I can get up in front of you and I can tell you what to do. Be good. Don't lie. Don't steal. Don't sleep with other guys' wives. Don't whatever. Or the other way is by example. I tell you a story about a guy, and when he lies, he's punished, and it turns out bad for him. But when he does good, he's rewarded, and it turns out well. And Sidney's argument, and later poets after him, that it's that second method of teaching that's better, because the audience doesn't know they're being taught. They just think they're reading a great story. And the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid and the Bible and they all work like that. There's occasional moments where people get up and give big lectures, but mostly it's stories about people. And when they do well, they are rewarded, and when they do poorly, they are punished. And we learn by example. And it's more fun. We engage with them as people. And we don't like to be lectured, but we love to hear stories. And in that sense, Beowulf is completely in that genre, as those other books we've been talking about. It's educational. I want to talk about this speech that Beowulf gives on 167. There's often one of the questions that people ask, and it links up with all those other mysteries in the book that we've been talking about at the beginning of our lecture today, is why doesn't Beowulf have kids? This is one of the great duties of a king, is to have children so that those children can inherit and the realm will be stable. After all, if Beowulf had a son, then when Beowulf dies fighting the dragon, the son would inherit and everything would be okay. And the Swedes would not invade because, that's Beowulf's son, right? But he never does that. And it's never really addressed. The closest we get to an address of this moment, and this mystery is part of the reason why in the movie, Gaiman decides that maybe in the original version, Beowulf sleeps with Grendel's mother and he gets a son, but the son is a monster because Grendel's mother is a monster, right? And so in that version, the dragon is Beowulf's son because, its mother is a monster. Well, maybe. But the closest the poem tells us is after the death of Hygelac son. Beowulf laments the death of this young man who was like a son to Beowulf. It's often called the Fathers Lament. It's a section from Beowulf, not that many lines. It's on 167. When the father is grieving for the death of his son. There's a kind of cosmic injustice when a father lives longer than his son. It should always be the other way around. The son should outlive the father. It was like the misery felt by an old man who has lived to see his son's body swing on the gallows. He begins to keen and weep for his boy, watching the raven gloat where he hangs. He can be of no help. The wisdom of age is worthless to him. Morning after morning, he wakes to remember that his child is gone. He has no interest in living on until another heir is born in the hall, now that his firstborn has entered death's dominion forever. He gazes sorrowfully at his son's dwelling, the banquet hall bereft of all delight, the wind-swept hearthstone. The horsemen are sleeping, the warriors underground. What was is no more. No tunes from the harp, no cheer raised in the yard. Alone with his longing, he lies down on his bed and sings a lament. Everything seems too large, the steadings and the fields. The world is just too big and too empty without his son in it. And it doesn't cheer him to know that he's going to have more kids. The death of his son is just too painful. Maybe this is why Beowulf doesn't have a son. Maybe the death of Hygelac son so affected him that he just didn't have any interest in it anymore. We've talked very briefly last session about the very few women in this poem. We have characters like Wealhtheow, and she has a daughter whom we see very briefly. We have the woman at the end of the poem, the end of Beowulf, who wails into the sky with grief. And we have characters like Modthryth, who appears on 156, in a story that Beowulf tells about a bad queen. And her problem was that Modthryth's problem is that she was very beautiful, but whenever anybody looked at her, in other words, they were staring at her because she was beautiful. Whenever she caught a guy staring, she would punish him. She would physically torture and kill them for staring. And it wasn't until she got married off that she kind of mellowed out and became a good queen. We've been suggesting that Beowulf is an educational poem. It's designed to teach people how to be good at whatever their role is in life. Think about all the people that would have been in the audience when this poem was told. Guy gets up in the middle of the hall. There's a bunch of the warriors. They're kind of like Beowulf. Maybe they're not that powerful, or maybe they're not that high in rank. Maybe they're more like Wiglaf. They're more like the guy who's, a helper. Or maybe they're the king, because the king's there too, right? The local lord, and they're more like Hrothgar or Beowulf at the end of the poem. And the queen's there. Wealhtheow, right, becomes their role model, and the royal sons and family are all there, and they sympathize with and identify with other characters in the book. This scene with Modthryth, in which Beowulf talks about how a bad queen gets punished and how a good queen should act, and how you turn a bad queen into a good queen, which in Beowulf's philosophy is as simple as, well, you got to marry her off, right? They just need a good husband, and that'll cure their problem. Well, I'm not saying the advice is all that sophisticated, but what we do see here is an attempt to address this educational idea for everybody, even the queen. This is the poet telling the queen, look, when a warrior in your court, you catch him looking at you, that doesn't mean he's going to rape you. He's a warrior and you're beautiful and he's looking at you. Go easy on him. If he does something more than that, well, then that's another issue. But if he's just looking at you, you should let him go. That's what the poem is saying. You can agree or disagree. If an eye not her lord's stared at her directly during daylight, the outcome was sealed. He was kept bound, in hand-tightened shackles, racked, tortured until doom was pronounced. Even a queen outstanding in beauty must not overstep like that. A queen should weave peace, not punish the innocent with loss of life for imagined insults. Think about Wealhtheow's job when she shows up. She walks around and she pours wine for everybody. She pours mead. She lavishes people with presents. She thanks Beowulf. And she says, oh, look, let me introduce you to my kids, the people that are going to inherit. She's a weaver of peace. She's that pretty girl behind the bar, but she's also the queen. And she's there to keep everybody kind of in a good mood. This is the queen's job in this society. All right, well, it's my hope that you find the poem interesting. And, finish it up. We'll put some more discussions and another quiz up. And then we'll start in next week on our next reading. But we spent a little bit of extra time on this poem, and I'm hoping that you'll find it worthwhile. If you have questions, email me. Don't be afraid to post, and we'll pick this up next week with the Inferno.